What if I told you that revenge can outlive the body that carried it? That beneath the silence of English manors and the chill of fog-soaked fields, some vows whispered at the altar still echo centuries later. This isn't a story about love. It's about what happens when love becomes a weapon and innocence becomes a curse. Welcome to Historic Book. Don't forget to subscribe, because tonight, we unearth a story that history tried to bury. The haunting tale of Eleanor Whitmore, the child bride who died too young, but whose vengeance refused to rest. In 1812, in the rural heart of Wiltshire, England, the Whitmore family's wealth was both blessing and poison. At just 12 years old, Eleanor was promised to Sir Alistair Hawthorne, a widowed man nearing 40, whose influence stretched from parish to parliament. Their union was not of affection, but of land and lineage. The villagers said the wedding bells rang hollow, as if the church itself recoiled from what it was forced to witness. Eleanor, pale as the lace on her gown, never looked up during the ceremony. Some swore they saw tears on her veil, others, frost. Within weeks, Eleanor vanished behind the iron gates of Hawthorne Manor. Servants whispered of screams muffled by music, of locked rooms where candles burned all night long. When winter came, the household fell silent, except for one sound, a single note from the piano that played itself long after midnight. The villagers thought it was wind through the shutters, until they saw Sir Alistair's carriage leave the estate one morning, carrying a coffin no bigger than a child. No one saw her burial. No priest was called. The coroner's record listed her cause of death as fever. But fever doesn't leave bruises around the throat. Fever doesn't fill hallways with the scent of iron and salt. Years passed, and the Whitmore name faded into church ledgers and dust. But the manor did not rest. Doors slammed when no one entered. Mirrors cracked without reason. And those who stayed overnight claimed to hear a child's lullaby, played on piano keys that no longer existed. The year after Eleanor's death, Hawthorne Manor stood almost entirely abandoned. The servants who had once filled its corridors with chatter and footsteps were gone, some dismissed, others fled without collecting pay. The few who remained spoke of doors that refused to stay shut, of portraits weeping condensation like tears, and of cold air that pooled only outside the late child's chamber. It was said that on certain nights, the piano, the same one Eleanor had been forbidden to touch, began to play by itself. The melody was faint, uneven, the way a child might play when trying to remember a song her mother once sang. Those who heard it claimed their skin turned cold, their breath visible, even in summer. By 1814, the estate had decayed into a monument of silence. Sir Alistair had remarried, this time to a London socialite named Margaret Penbrook, a woman as ambitious as she was beautiful. She despised the countryside, calling it a place where the dead still think themselves alive. The villagers whispered that she avoided the West Wing entirely. She would not walk near Eleanor's old room, and refused to keep candles there. When a visiting clergyman asked why, she simply said, "Because sometimes she answers when you speak." It wasn't long before the haunting grew bolder. Guests began to complain of soft humming at night, the same lullaby that once drifted from the piano room. Some said they saw a girl in white standing by the staircase, her face blurred like frost on glass. Others awoke to find their hands covered in fine black soot, though no fire had burned in the manor for days. The cook, Mrs. Elmore, swore she saw muddy footprints appear across the kitchen tiles, small, bare, and leading straight to the cellar door. Sir Alistair dismissed every report, calling it rural superstition. But those who knew him said his confidence was a mask. He stopped sleeping in his own bed, moving from room to room like a hunted man. One morning, he appeared at the parish office, demanding all church bells be silenced during storm nights. He claimed their echoes disturbed him, that they woke her. The priest noted his request, but his hands trembled as he wrote. In the village records, the entry still exists, ink faded but legible. Lord Hawthorne complains of nightly music, a tune not played by mortal hands. By the spring of 1815, fear had taken root in every corner of Hawthorne Manor. The staff kept their rosaries close, whispering prayers before crossing the West Hall. The air inside had changed, thick, metallic, like rain on iron. It was during this time that the first signs of violence appeared. Margaret Penbroke awoke one night to find long scratches on her wrists, as if she'd been clawed by a small hand. The windows were locked, her door bolted. She screamed for her husband, but Sir Alistair, sleeping 2 rooms away, never came. The next morning, when he finally appeared, he looked pale and gaunt, muttering something about hearing the piano again. Only this time, it wasn't playing, it was pounding. Days later, a maid named Clara was found unconscious at the foot of the stairs. She swore that she'd seen a child's figure on the landing, standing perfectly still. Her eyes, she said through trembling lips. They weren't eyes at all, just emptiness. The doctor diagnosed hysteria, but Clara never returned. Within a week, half the servants resigned. Those who remained nailed crosses to their doors and refused to go upstairs after dusk. Sir Alistair's new wife, Margaret, tried to bring priests from London to bless the manor, but none stayed the night. One friar collapsed in the corridor, claiming he heard a child crying from beneath the floorboards. Another refused to enter the west wing altogether, saying the walls remembered pain. Margaret began sleeping with the curtains drawn and her Bible under her pillow. She told friends in letters that still survive in local archives, that she often woke to the feeling of someone sitting at the edge of her bed, humming softly in the dark. By midsummer, villagers avoided the estate entirely. Children dared each other to run past the gate, and those who did swore they heard faint piano keys echoing from inside. Even though the windows had been boarded up for months, the manor was becoming something more than cursed. It was alive. And yet, not a single soul dared confront Sir Alistair, not even when his own coachman was found dead by the stables, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. The coroner called it an accident. The villagers called it justice. By the winter of 1816, Sir Alistair Hawthorne had become a ghost among the living. He rarely left the manor, wandering its halls wrapped in the same black coat he had worn to Eleanor's funeral. The servants spoke of him muttering to the walls, begging forgiveness from someone unseen. He burned her portrait once, then had it repainted exactly as before, claiming that destroying it made her come closer. At the village tavern, coachmen whispered that the Lord of Hawthorne Manor had started digging in the orchard at night, lantern in hand, muttering about setting her free. None dared to follow him. Those who peeked from afar swore they saw 2 shadows moving, not one. Newspapers began to take notice. The Wiltshire Gazette published a short column, "Strange Disturbances at Hawthorne Estate." It described cold spots, unexplainable sounds, and a master haunted by matrimonial sorrow. Though names were withheld, everyone in the county knew. Parish letters recorded that cattle refused to graze near the property and birds would not nest in its trees. Even the river beside it turned sluggish and dark, as if mourning. Then came the night of the great frost. Margaret Penbroke was found half-conscious at the foot of Eleanor's old room, her hair frozen to the floorboards, frost blooming around her as if she'd been lying in snow. She survived, but her mind never did. Witnesses said she repeated one phrase over and over: "She's under the piano." When villagers entered the manor days later, they found the grand instrument sealed shut, its strings cut clean, as though someone had silenced it by force. Sir Alistair vanished soon after. His horse was discovered at the edge of Blackmere Woods, reins torn, saddle slick with ice. Of the man himself, not a trace. The manor fell into ruin. Windows shattered, ivy crept through the walls, and for decades only the bravest, or the foolish, approached its gates. Yet through the years, travelers claimed to hear the faint echo of piano keys from within the rubble. Some swore the tune changed with the season, others that it wept. And always, faintly, a child's voice followed. "Till death do us part." By 1818, what remained of Hawthorne Manor had become a curiosity for scholars and thrill-seekers alike. London papers began linking the Hawthorne curse to the growing moral panic over England's forgotten brides, girls sold into marriage long before they understood its weight. Reformists like Mary Wollstonecraft had written against such unions decades earlier, but the law still allowed fathers to barter daughters as property. Eleanor's name began to appear in pamphlets about the ruin of the innocent, her story whispered beside those of real girls, Mary Ashford, Elizabeth Finning, Sarah Malcolm, whose deaths had shocked polite society. Yet none of them, said the writers, had stayed. A historian named Dr. Joseph Lambden from Bath visited the estate that autumn. His journal, now preserved in the Wiltshire Record Office, describes finding children's drawings nailed inside a cupboard, stick figures, a house, and a single word scrawled beneath, "Mine." Lambden noted that the ink was modern, not faded. Someone had added it long after Eleanor's death. He left before nightfall, claiming that the air tasted of rust and lilac, the scent one breathes before a storm. 2 weeks later, he drowned himself in the Avon, pockets filled with black piano keys. The scandal revived Parliament's debate on child marriage. Preachers used Hawthorne Manor as proof that sin invited haunting, while reformers called it an allegory of women imprisoned by law. But locals in Wiltshire told another version, that Sir Alistair's fortune had been built on the dowries of orphaned girls, and that Eleanor's ghost had simply come to collect her due. In taverns, men swore the fog over the manor moved against the wind. Coachmen reported hearing a child's laughter under their wheels when they passed the gate. By 1820, spiritualist circles adopted her as a symbol, the bride undying. Mediums claimed to summon her in candlelit parlors, describing a thin girl with lace gloves and eyes, like moonlit water. Most were frauds, but one séance in Bristol produced a sound that witnesses still argued over. A single, perfect piano note that rang for nearly a minute before fading into silence. The participants fled the room. Only the hostess remained, whispering to the empty chair across from her, "I'm sorry." None knew what she meant, but the story ensured that Eleanor Whitmore's name would never truly vanish. By 1842, the manor had almost vanished beneath ivy and rot, but the legend had grown roots deeper than its foundations. The new owners, the Edevanes, arrived from London with plans to restore the property and prove the haunting a myth. Their son, Thomas Edevane, was an amateur chemist fascinated by the recent craze for scientific proof of the supernatural. He brought with him a contraption of brass tubes and glass plates, an early attempt at recording sound vibrations. Locals called it the spirit cage. Thomas believed if the haunting were real, he could capture its voice. For months, he worked by candlelight, sleeping beside his machine in what had once been Eleanor's bedroom. His notes spoke of whispers that shimmer in the air and cold that forms around words. Each morning, he found his equipment shifted or dismantled, though he slept with the door locked. Servants quit one by one, complaining of footsteps pacing above them even when the upper floors were empty. In late autumn, Thomas claimed success. He told his father he had recorded a girl's breathing, faint but measured, followed by a single chord on an unseen piano. He insisted the sound was neither echo nor wind. The family prepared a demonstration for the local papers, eager to humiliate the skeptics. The gathering was held on November 2nd, the same date, villagers whispered, as Eleanor's wedding day. Candles lined the great hall, their light trembling against cracked portraits. Thomas wound his device, a low mechanical purr filling the air. Then the machine began to play. At first came static, a hiss like steam escaping stone. Then, clear as a heartbeat, a child exhaled. A few guests smiled nervously, until the piano note sounded. Not from the machine, but from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate, echoing through every wall. The candles snuffed out in a single breath. Panic scattered the crowd. When torches were relit, Thomas was gone. Only the recorder remained, still turning, its cylinder etched with fresh scratches that spelled a single word in uneven script. Why? Days later, his father found Thomas in the orchard, seated before an open grave that hadn't been there the night before. His eyes were open, his face calm, frost sparkling on his lashes. The local doctor wrote that death had come, without injury or cause. The machine was buried with him. But on quiet evenings, passers-by claimed they could still hear its faint clicking, like a heart refusing to stop. By the 1860s, The rise of spirit photography had turned the legend of Eleanor Whitmore into a national obsession. Across England, photographers claimed they could capture the presence of the dead on glass. In London, the studios of William Mumler and Frederick Hudson sold portraits where faint, ghostly faces hovered behind grieving relatives. Many were proven fakes, but one photograph, taken at the decaying Hawthorne Manor, defied explanation. The photographer, Samuel Raines, was a quiet man from Manchester who had spent months seeking a true haunting to make his name. He arrived with a bulky camera, a tripod, and plates coated in silver nitrate. The morning was bleak and still. No birds sang. Raines described feeling as though the world had paused to listen. He focused his lens on the broken windows, the crumbling piano, and the long-abandoned nursery. But when the plate was developed hours later, a figure appeared. A child, standing near the piano, hands folded, head tilted ever so slightly, as if listening to something beyond the camera's reach. Her eyes, though faint, seemed to follow the viewer. Raines fainted upon seeing it. When he awoke, he found his equipment in ashes, though there had been no fire. The plate, miraculously, remained intact. Raines carried the image back to London, where it caused immediate uproar. Spiritualist societies proclaimed it the proof of Whitmore. Skeptics called it fraud. Newspapers printed it under headlines like "The Bride's Child Returns" and "Manchester's Frozen Angel." Even Queen Victoria's advisors, fascinated by seances and mourning rituals, reportedly requested to see the image. But Raines refused to part with it. He became paranoid, sleeping with the photograph under his pillow, claiming it changed slightly each night. Some said he began to talk to it, calling the figure Eleanor. Within months, his neighbors reported screams from his studio, and on a cold January morning of 1865, he was found dead at his desk, his eyes burned white, the plate shattered on the floor. Every fragment bore the same strange pattern, a single piano key etched by hand. After his death, no one could locate the negatives. His family destroyed his remaining work, and the photograph itself was said to have vanished into the archives of a private collector, one who, decades later, would confess that sometimes, when the gaslights dimmed, he heard a girl humming from inside his locked cabinet. In 1881, Hawthorne Manor passed into the hands of the Society for Psychical Inquiry, a small circle of scientists and spiritualists who hoped to reconcile faith and reason. Their leader, Professor August Fielding, had read every mention of Eleanor Whitmore in newspapers and parish records, convinced that the haunting hid a natural phenomenon, something electrical, magnetic, or yet unnamed. He brought with him a photographer, 2 mediums, a chemist, and a young stenographer named Harriet Vale to record every event. They set up camp inside the Great Hall, hanging white sheets to catch light and dust, marking every temperature drop and tremor. The piano, long silent, sat in the corner beneath layers of soot. On the first night, Fielding declared the experiment simple. If ghosts exist, we shall measure them. At midnight, the air grew heavy. Harriet Vale described hearing a faint breathing, as though the house inhaled. The thermometers dipped. Lamps flickered though the windows were sealed. The mediums began to chant, asking for Eleanor by name. From the corridor came the unmistakable sound of bare feet on stone. One of the mediums collapsed, whispering, "She knows we are watching." Fielding demanded everyone remain calm. He raised his lantern, and every clock in the manor stopped. The next morning, they discovered each sheet marked by a damp handprint, small and perfect, arranged in a circle around the piano. Fielding collected samples, insisting the moisture was condensation from drafts. Yet Harriet's notes grew fearful. She wrote that the piano's keys had shifted during the night, forming a single chord. The chemist, Mr. Alcott, refused to stay another evening after finding his own name scratched into his lamp glass. When the group reconvened, Fielding demanded a final test: exposure photography during the seance. The plates were developed hours later and showed not one but 6 figures standing behind the team, identical silhouettes of a child facing away from the lens. Fielding left Hawthorne Manor soon after, his report never published. Harriet Vale's diary ends abruptly with a single line: The experiment succeeded. She measured us instead. The society dissolved within the year. Its members scattered, each claiming to have heard faint music when they closed their eyes. The manor, once again, was abandoned to the ivy and the silence that followed every question asked too loudly. By 1903, the manor had become nothing more than a rumor cloaked in ivy, a husk of stone glimpsed by travelers through the Wiltshire fog. But one winter afternoon, archivist William Harrow stumbled upon a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth within the basement of the Royal Society's records. Inside lay a diary, its spine cracked and pages yellowed, the name Harriet Vale etched in delicate handwriting across the first leaf. Most entries were brittle, nearly erased by time. Yet one passage remained clear, a description of the experiment, and a final note beneath it. She was not alone. Harrow, intrigued, began compiling references to the long-forgotten case. He uncovered parish burial records listing two Whitmores, father and daughter, both deceased the same week of 1812. But under cause of death, Eleanor's entry read only one word, unconfirmed. When Harrow brought this to his colleagues, laughter followed. The Edwardian era was too rational for ghosts. But curiosity is a quiet infection. Soon, he had a small circle of supporters, historians, skeptics, even a photographer named Amelia Cross who specialized in documenting ruins. Together they traveled to Wiltshire, intent on seeing what remained of the manor. They arrived beneath a sky bruised with thunder. The manor loomed like a skeleton, roof half collapsed, windows nothing but empty sockets. Inside, the air was thick with damp and dust. Cross set up her camera, using magnesium flashes to illuminate the great hall. When the powder ignited, the light revealed a piano standing miraculously intact amid the wreckage, a single white key pressed down. Harrow felt a chill so deep it rattled his bones. "This," he whispered, "is where she ended." That night, as rain lashed the roof, Harrow studied the diary by lamplight. Between its pages he found something strange, a pressed violet, perfectly preserved, though no flowers had bloomed there in decades. He held it to the flame, and the piano sounded one note, clear as breath. The others heard it too. The group fled the house, but Cross's camera had already captured its truth. In her final photograph, developed days later, stood the shape of a young girl reflected in a cracked mirror, face hidden, hand reaching forward, as if still waiting for someone to keep their promise. In 1905, Amelia Cross exhibited her photograph at the Royal Academy's Modern Miracles show, intending it as proof of nothing more than the strange play of light in ruined stone. Yet the public saw something else. Viewers crowded the hall, whispering that the faint outline in the cracked mirror looked too deliberate, too human. Newspapers printed grainy copies under headlines like "The Bride of Hawthorne Returns." Overnight, the forgotten story of Eleanor Whitmore bloomed again across England. Spiritualists hailed the image as the first authentic portrait of a ghost. Skeptics dissected it in print, calling it a trick of double exposure. Amelia maintained her composure during interviews, though privately, she confessed to friends that the negative had begun to change, its edges clouding, as if the shadow within were still developing. By the third week of the exhibition, museum guards reported odd disturbances, the glass protecting the photograph misting over from inside, the temperature dropping sharply in the corner where it hung. A visitor fainted after claiming to hear the distant echo of piano notes whenever he stared at the girl's reflected hand. The Academy closed the room for maintenance, but by then the legend had already escaped into London streets. Publishers rushed to print pamphlets retelling the Whitmore haunting, mixing fragments of truth with wild invention. Street vendors sold postcards of the manor ruins stamped, "Death couldn't touch her." In Whitechapel taverns, patrons swore that on fog-thick nights a small figure could be seen beneath the gas lamps, barefoot, watching the crowds but never leaving footprints. Amelia Cross, exhausted by attention, withdrew from public life. Letters to colleagues hinted at sleeplessness and the sense of being followed by quiet steps. Her final correspondence, dated February 1906, described a dream in which she walked through the gallery alone. Every painting had vanished except one, a mirror showing the reflection of her own face, and behind her, a child's hand resting gently on her shoulder. After that, Amelia disappeared from record. Her rooms were found untouched except for the camera on her desk, its shutter open, a strip of unexposed film still inside. When developed weeks later, the image showed nothing but an empty chair and, in its shadow, the suggestion of folded hands, waiting. By the 1920s, the story of Eleanor Whitmore had drifted from history into legend, yet every generation seemed determined to call her back. When moving pictures began sweeping through Europe, her tale found new form in flickering black and white reels. A small production house in Kent released a silent film titled The Widow's Child, inspired by an authentic haunting in Wiltshire. The director, Harold Litton, prided himself on using only natural light and genuine locations. He shot the film inside the ruins of Hawthorne Manor, despite warnings from locals who refused to step foot beyond the gates. The final scenes, he claimed, required no special effects. The mist performed on its own. Audiences adored it. Critics called the film too realistic, praising the spectral shadows that seemed to move independently of the actors. Litton insisted the shadows were tricks of exposure, but his cinematographer disagreed. In interviews, he confessed that frames appeared on the negatives he hadn't filmed at all, a child's figure standing near the piano, head turned slightly toward the camera. The crew laughed it off during editing, though several reported dreams of the same girl, always silent, always waiting beside a mirror. The film premiered in London in 1923 to a full house. When the credits rolled, the crowd applauded, until the projector jammed midway through the final frame. On screen, frozen in a wash of white light, stood the image of the girl again, sharper this time, as if stepping closer from another reel. The audience fell silent. Then the lights came on, and the image was gone. Litton dismissed it as mechanical failure, but the rumor spread faster than any advertisement. Within months, prints of the widow's child were screened across Europe, each carrying its own peculiar distortions. In some versions, the reflection in the manor's mirror moved. In others, faint piano music bled through the silent footage. By 1925, film historians dubbed it the haunted reel. Scholars argued over its anomalies for decades, yet no two surviving prints were ever identical. Even today, archivists claim that when projected in total darkness, a final, unrecorded title card sometimes appears before the screen fades to black. She remembers. After the Second World War, a new generation of scholars took interest in forgotten English folklore, searching for the truth behind local legends. Among them was Dr. Ruth Calder, a historian from Oxford known for her obsession with psychological hauntings, cases where grief seemed to echo through place rather than person. In 1949, she came across a faded article in the Manchester Guardian about the Whitmore haunting and decided to investigate. The war had left much of the countryside scarred, and Hawthorne Manor lay beneath decades of ruin, its walls strangled by ivy, its floors carpeted in ash and glass. Calder, armed with a field recorder and a Leica camera, traveled there accompanied by two graduate assistants. Her goal was simple: to map the legend, gather testimonies, and document how myth survived in modern minds. Villagers spoke of the manor the way soldiers spoke of battlefields, with respect and unease. One elderly man remembered seeing the piano through a gap in the wall as a boy, a single key pressed, as if someone had only just left. Calder listened, taking careful notes, recording every pause and tremor in their voices. She wanted proof that stories could stain memory like smoke, long after the fire had gone out. Inside the manor, Calder found silence so complete it felt deliberate. Her team set up microphones among the debris, letting the reels spin through the night. They expected nothing more than wind and rodents. But by morning, the recordings held faint, rhythmic tones, irregular but unmistakably musical. Calder analyzed them for weeks, convinced they were distant echoes of passing trains. Yet when the tapes were played backward, the rhythm changed, forming a pattern that resembled the heartbeat of a child. The assistants grew restless, and one refused to return, claiming to hear piano notes in her dreams. Calder's final report, published in 1950 under the title Residual Memory and the Modern Haunting, argued that certain tragedies imprint emotional energy on physical space. Hawthorne Manor, she wrote, was not haunted by a ghost, but by the shape of sorrow itself. Critics dismissed it as romantic nonsense, but her paper quietly influenced a generation of psychologists exploring trauma and space. Decades later, when her recordings were digitized, technicians noted a soft voice buried in the static. 3 syllables, whispered low. Most couldn't agree on what it said. A few, listening closely, swore it was a name, Eleanor. By the 1970s, Hawthorne Manor had become little more than a story whispered between scholars and thrill-seekers. When British television began producing programs about folklore and the paranormal, the name Eleanor Whitmore resurfaced. A young documentarian named Simon Reeve found Ruth Calder's 1950 paper in a university archive and was struck by its quiet melancholy. He decided to make a film about how myths remember what people forget. Reeve's team visited the Wiltshire ruins with portable cameras and reel-to-reel recorders, expecting to capture only the creak of branches and the hum of distant traffic. What they found instead was atmosphere, heavy, metallic air and a silence that seemed almost staged. It felt, one cameraman later said, as if we were walking through someone else's memory. The documentary aired in 1974 under the title Echoes of Eleanor. Its tone was academic, yet viewers wrote letters describing strange coincidences, clocks stopping during the broadcast, pianos sounding faintly in neighboring rooms. The BBC dismissed it as hysteria, but the film gained a cult following. For the first time in decades, the story left Wiltshire and entered living rooms across Britain. University students began traveling to the manor, taking photographs, collecting fragments of stone as souvenirs. Folklorists called the phenomenon modern haunting, a place rebuilt by belief alone. Reeve himself became uneasy with his success. During a follow-up interview, he admitted that the final reel of Echoes of Eleanor contained several seconds of footage no one on the crew remembered filming. A shot of the great hall lit by morning sun, the piano lid open, dust motes drifting like ash. In the corner stood a blurred silhouette, neither adult nor child. Technicians claimed it was light leakage, but Reeve refused to include it in the broadcast. He stored the reel in a private archive, where it would remain unseen for decades. By the end of the decade, Eleanor Whitmore had become a symbol again, not of terror, but of unresolved grief. Writers described her as England's silent conscience, the ghost of every forgotten girl lost to time. In galleries, her name appeared beneath abstract paintings of fog and broken instruments. In classrooms, she was cited as proof that legends evolve when truth is too painful to face. Hawthorne Manor, crumbling yet stubborn, endured as a monument to that memory. By the early 2000s, the story of Eleanor Whitmore had all but faded from libraries, preserved only in obscure journals and grainy VHS recordings of Echoes of Eleanor. Then the internet, that vast collector of forgotten fragments, unearthed her name once more. A blogger researching abandoned estates in Wiltshire uploaded a series of photographs. The ivy-drowned facade of Hawthorne Manor, its windows like blackened eyes, its doorway marked by weather-worn initials, E.W. 1812. Within days, the post spread through online forums dedicated to lost architecture and haunted places. Commenters claimed the images gave them migraines, that their computer speakers emitted faint piano chords when viewed at midnight. Others dismissed it as compression noise, but the fascination had begun. A new generation of storytellers started piecing together the scraps. Calder's report, Reeve's missing reel, and local census records that listed in Eleanor Whitmore, deceased age 12, then abruptly struck the name through in red ink. Digital archivists from a London museum launched a small restoration project to stabilize the manor before it collapsed completely. They expected rotten timbers and empty rooms. Instead, they found remnants of a nursery, wallpaper patterned with faded moons, and a child's hair ribbon preserved in the dust. The find reignited interest worldwide. Podcasts retold the tale with cinematic sound design, layering Calder's surviving audio beneath whispered reenactments. YouTube channels dissected every rumor. Was Eleanor a victim, a myth, a metaphor? Each upload attracted thousands of comments, half analysis, half confession. Listeners reported dreams of corridors lit by oil lamps, of a piano key pressed by invisible hands. Some even traveled to Wiltshire, leaving flowers through the rusted gates as though paying respects to someone they'd once known. When the museum released a virtual reality reconstruction of the manor in 2019, users exploring the model noticed an anomaly. In one corner of the Grand Hall, the light flickered and refused to render properly, forming a human-shaped blur. Technicians corrected it repeatedly. The glitch returned every update. Online communities began calling it the Whitmore patch. It wasn't fear that drove them anymore, but empathy. Eleanor had become the ghost of lost childhood itself, lingering in code, in photographs, in the imagination of everyone who sought her story. During the first phase of physical restoration in 2021, workers clearing the west wing of Hawthorne Manor discovered something unexpected wedged inside a collapsed chimney stack. A small, oil-stained box lined with faded silk. Inside lay a child's diary bound in cracked leather, its pages browned and fused by smoke. The handwriting was careful, almost adult. Each entry began with the same words, "For Mother." The museum's conservators spent months humidifying and separating the paper until the text became legible. The first dated page read June 1812, and the author identified herself as Eleanor Whitmore, age 12. What began as simple accounts of lessons and household chores shifted, midway through the book, into a strange mixture of fear and defiance. She wrote about the quiet corridor that breathes, and of a man who calls himself father but wears another man's voice. The final entry ended abruptly after the words, "He says I am to play for him tonight." Scholars knew at once they were handling either a historical treasure or a deliberate forgery. Ink analysis placed the materials squarely in the early 19th century. The find was authenticated enough to go public, and within weeks news outlets were running headlines like, "The Ghost Girl Speaks." Crowds gathered outside the museum, hoping to glimpse the diary under glass. Yet the diary raised more questions than it answered. No record of an Eleanor Whitmore appeared in parish registries for that year, and the supposed guardians she described matched no local family. Linguists noticed that certain phrases, borrowed air, the room that dreams, echoed expressions used decades later by Ruth Calder in her 1950 thesis. How could the same imagery appear in texts separated by a century and a half? Some suggested that Calder had unconsciously absorbed local oral traditions that originated with the diary. Others hinted at the unprovable, that Calder might have read the manuscript herself long before its discovery. For the public, none of that mattered. The diary humanized the legend. It gave the ghost a voice. Visitors stood before the display case in silence, listening through headphones that played a recording of pages turning. When the exhibition traveled to Manchester, attendance doubled. The past, it seemed, was speaking in first person again. Hawthorne Manor, once dismissed as superstition, had become the country's most studied ruin, and its most mourned. By the spring of 2022, the investigation had grown beyond historians. Psychologists, digital archivists, even sound engineers joined what the press dubbed the Whitmore Project. Its goal was to trace how one 19th-century tragedy had survived for 200 years in memory, rumor, and code. The research team installed environmental sensors inside Hawthorne Manor to capture temperature, vibration, and acoustic patterns. They weren't hunting ghosts. They were studying how buildings remember trauma. What they found was disquieting. Each night, between 2:14 and 2:17 a.m., microphones recorded a faint metallic resonance that traveled from room to room like a heartbeat through walls. It matched no known mechanical source. When the data were plotted visually, the waveform resembled a musical signature, 7 uneven peaks, precisely mirroring the opening notes of a children's lullaby noted in the recovered diary. Coincidence, they said, but the pattern repeated for weeks. The phenomenon leaked online, spawning countless breakdown videos and forum threads titled "The Manor Sings at Night." The team remained cautious, yet one researcher confessed in her logbook that the sound evoked an overwhelming sadness, as if the building itself is mourning. Her entry went viral, quoted on art blogs and conspiracy sites alike. Interest in Eleanor surged once again. She became an emblem not only of the uncanny, but of the way grief lingers in matter itself. To separate myth from psychology, the project cross-referenced every known piece of evidence: Calder's recordings, Reeves' lost reel, the diary, and now the acoustic data. Overlaying them produced a timeline of echoes, each generation hearing something slightly different, yet always returning to the same motif. Music, mourning, a child's presence framed by adult guilt. Documentaries followed, slickly edited with candlelit recreations and slow aerial shots of Wiltshire mist. Audiences responded less with fear than with pity. Maybe, one narrator mused, the haunting was never Eleanor's doing at all. Maybe it was ours, for refusing to let her rest. As public fascination grew, the museum struggled with ethical questions. Was the legend being honored or exploited? They released a statement reminding viewers that Eleanor Whitmore remained an unverified historical figure. Still, each night new flowers appeared at the gates of Hawthorne Manor, their stems tucked between rusted bars. Someone had begun leaving sheet music too, handwritten copies of the same 7-note lullaby. No one ever claimed them. When the museum announced the Whitmore exhibition, crowds queued along the Thames before dawn. The curators transformed an old railway depot into a labyrinth of rooms that recreated the manor's architecture in fragments: faded wallpaper, creaking floorboards, a suspended chandelier that swayed when no one passed beneath it. Visitors followed a narrow path lit by a single overhead lamp, listening through headphones to remastered clips of Calder's field recordings. Each visitor heard a different mix: childlike laughter for some, static and wind for others. The final chamber held the diary itself, displayed under low amber light. A soft hum played in the background, almost imperceptible until it began forming slow, rhythmic chords. No one on staff admitted to adding that track. Yet, by the second week, the curators noticed people leaving in tears, whispering that they'd heard the words "for Mother." News outlets framed the exhibition as an exploration of collective grief and how technology turns myth into memory. But others sensed something deeper. A guard described hearing faint tapping on the glass case after closing time. Sound technicians found new data imprinted onto the playback reels, as if the recordings were rewriting themselves each night. It wasn't proof of the supernatural. It was proof that stories evolve when we listen too hard. By the exhibition's final week, attendance exceeded 250,000. Social media feeds filled with black and white photos tagged #Eleanor Returns. Images of visitors standing motionless beneath the suspended chandelier, their reflections warped in the polished floor. The museum's director, exhausted but proud, wrote that the show had given the ghost back to history. Yet the closing night left a strange residue. Security cameras recorded a sudden power drop exactly at 2:15 a.m., the same time the manor's sensors once registered that musical heartbeat. For 23 seconds, every monitor flickered to a single frozen frame, the diary's final line, magnified and pulsing in grayscale pixels. When power returned, the building was silent. No alarms, no staff movement. Only the low echo of a single piano note drifting through the hall, too faint for microphones to locate. Afterward, analysts blamed magnetic interference from nearby train lines, and the museum reopened to tourists as normal. But employees spoke of a lingering heaviness, a sense that the story hadn't ended, only changed form. One of them, a night guard, later said he'd begun to dream in monochrome, always of the same corridor, always hearing the small voice whisper again, "For Mother." After the exhibition closed, fragments of its recordings leaked online and spread far beyond Britain. Audio engineers in Japan, Brazil, and the United States began remixing the faint hum that had underscored the final room. What began as curiosity turned into an international art movement known as the Whitmore Resonance. Musicians stretched the sound into 20-minute ambient pieces. Visual artists paired it with flickering 19th-century daguerreotypes. Every version seemed to carry the same undertone, a low, pulsing cadence that listeners described as the feeling of a heartbeat underwater. Scholars compared the phenomenon to medieval hymns built from echoes of lost chants, repetition turning grief into ritual. University conferences discussed whether technology had given Eleanor new life or merely amplified humanity's longing for connection. Psychologists observed that viewers exposed to the recordings reported a shared dream motif, a candle guttering beside a piano, a child's hand turning a page. Statistically insignificant, perhaps, but eerily consistent across continents. What had once been local folklore now moved like electricity through data cables, intangible yet deeply human. Meanwhile, developers proposed a full digital reconstruction of Hawthorne Manor for a virtual reality museum. The team mapped every surviving photograph, every architectural drawing, feeding them into algorithms that filled the gaps. When the prototype launched, users described an uncanny realism. The creak of floorboards timed with their steps, the filtered light through cracked windows. On the first public test, thousands logged in simultaneously. For several minutes, the servers held steady. Then every screen flickered to monochrome. Across the network, a single message appeared in antique serif type. "Play for him tonight." The phrase came directly from the diary's final entry. Engineers traced it to no system command, no human input. The glitch was isolated, purged, and explained away as corrupted metadata, yet the moment cemented the legend's next evolution. The haunting had migrated from stone and paper to signal and code, proof that memory, especially collective memory, needs no body to endure. Hawthorne Manor existed now wherever someone remembered the story. By 2024, the Whitmore story had become part of the cultural landscape. University lectures, streaming docuseries, digital art installations, even classroom discussions about folklore and empathy. The manor itself, fenced and monitored, remained untouched. Yet each winter solstice locals claimed to see a pale light moving behind its upper windows. Drones flown overhead captured nothing unusual, only swirling dust reflecting moonlight, but the legend persisted. Viewers of the original Echoes of Eleanor began uploading remastered versions, aligning Ruth Calder's 1950 audio with modern footage. The combination produced something neither academic nor paranormal, just profoundly sad. It reminded audiences that stories survive because someone still feels the ache they describe. A historian named Grace Tennant published a book titled Memory Without Witness. She argued that Eleanor was never one child but a collage of all the unnamed girls lost to 19th-century poverty, disease, and silence. Her thesis reframed the haunting as an act of collective remembrance, a country's subconscious preserving its shame in the shape of a ghost. The idea spread quickly. Readers wept, not out of fear, but recognition. "We are haunted," Tennant wrote, "because forgetting would be worse." Media producers seized on Tennant's interpretation, releasing a new series that blended dramatization with real scholarship. It opened not with screams, but with the sound of pages turning, the diary read aloud by a child actor. Over slow black and white shots of Wiltshire fields, a narrator asked, "What if haunting is only history, refusing silence?" The phrase became the project's tagline, printed on posters, quoted in classrooms, etched into online comments. For many, the Whitmore legend stopped being about a ghost at all. It became a meditation on how people process guilt, how trauma echoes through generations, and how empathy itself can feel like possession. By the end of the decade, few cared whether Eleanor had existed as a person. Her name had become a language, a way to speak of loss when ordinary words felt too small. Scholars began cataloging thousands of creative works inspired by the myth: poems, photographs, sound collages, even lullabies written in her key. The haunting had turned into heritage. In that transformation lay the truest form of resurrection, remembrance. Every legend eventually reaches the point where its truth no longer matters, only what it reveals about those who keep telling it. In the case of Eleanor Whitmore, 2 centuries of retellings turned one child's shadow into a mirror. She became the orphan of every city, the silence in every empty room, the small echo behind every story that refuses to fade. Hawthorne Manor still stands in ruins, its roof caved in, its windows blind. Yet on certain nights the wind through the rafters carries a strange cadence, like the ghost of a lullaby shaped by air and memory. Visitors say it's the sound of the structure settling or distant traffic through the valley. But if you stand there long enough, you might think you hear words threading through the rhythm, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. For Mother. Historians will tell you that ghosts are only metaphors, that the human mind projects pattern onto chaos. Maybe they're right. But stories like this persist because they answer a quieter question, not whether the dead speak, but whether we ever truly stop listening. The girl science couldn't explain became something larger than fear. She became remembrance itself, proof that even in decay, history hums. Perhaps the real haunting is not in Hawthorne Manor, but in us, the ones who can't look away. The camera would drift through corridors of dust and half-light, lingering on the cracked piano lid, the child's ribbon caught in a splintered beam. Outside, dawn would break over Wiltshire fields, washing the ruins in pale gold. No figure appears, no scream punctures the quiet. Only the echo of keys pressed once and left to ring through centuries. Fade to black. Thank you for joining us inside Historic Book, where the past never truly dies. Subscribe for more histories that whisper, for the shadows that remember what we forget. Until next time, keep your lights low and listen carefully. Some echoes never fade.